Doxar's boarding team dropped through the breach and found a man calmly peeling vegetables. Not hiding, not running, just standing at a steel prep counter in the corner of the cargo bay, a small curved knife in his hand, working the skin off a root vegetable in one long ribbon like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look up when 6 armored Vorai soldiers hit the deck around him. Fleet Commander Doxar watched the feed from his command chair on absolute authority and felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for yet. 31 years of Vorai raids on the human trade lanes, and not one merchant crew had ever done anything but scream, run, or beg. 47 vessels boarded in 6 years under his own command. None of them had surprised him. The bioluminescent ridges along his jaw pulsed a slow, satisfied blue. Routine. Another cargo hauler too slow to outrun a raider wing, too poor to afford real escort. His recognition software had confirmed it twice. Hull signature, engine heat bloom, transponder history, going back 11 years of legitimate trade runs between Ketavar and the outer colonies. Steady commerce. A grain and machine parts freighter with a captain who paid her port fees on time and never once fired a weapon at anybody. Boarding team reports 0 resistance, his second said. 1 civilian, unarmed in the cargo bay. Should we detain him? Doxar almost said no. Almost told them to move past the cook and secure the bridge, the way he had 47 times before. He was about to meet the one that would surprise him. Detain everyone, he said instead, and did not know why he'd said it. The man at the counter set the knife down. He set it down with the specific unhurriedness of someone who is not in a hurry because there is nothing left in the world to be in a hurry about. Then he wiped his hands on his apron, and one of the Vorai soldiers reached for his wrist, and the lights in the cargo bay turned red. I'll be honest. What happened in the next 4 minutes rewrote everything the Vorai hegemony thought it knew about human trade. Stay close. 6 hours earlier, Vice Admiral Mira Vasquez was drinking coffee out of a mug with a crack running halfway down the handle. She'd had the mug 11 years, kept it through 2 ship transfers and 1 hull breach that should have killed everyone in the galley. It was chipped on the rim in a way that made you tilt your head to drink from the right side, and she'd stopped noticing the chip so long ago that she only remembered it existed when someone new commented on it. Nobody new had commented on it in 4 years. That was sort of the point. She wore a faded blue commercial captain's jacket over a uniform most of her crew had never seen underneath it. On her sleeve, if you looked close, you could still make out the ghost of a merchant registry patch that had been there so long the fabric had faded lighter around its edges than the rest of the coat. All 8 ships checking in, her first officer said from the console beside her. Formation holding. Vorai Raider wing is 30 minutes out on the profile we expected. Comms traffic. Nothing unusual. They think we're a grain convoy. We are a grain convoy, Vasquez said, and meant it. 40% of steady commerce's hold really was grain, bound for a real contract with a real buyer in the Ketavar exchange, a contract Vasquez had personally negotiated 11 years ago and renewed every single season since. The rest of the hold was something else, but the grain was real. That was the part nobody on the Vorai side had ever understood. Down in the galley, Petty Officer Thomas Herrera was peeling a crate of root vegetables for the evening meal, same as he did most days at this hour, because a merchant ship that stopped cooking real food for its real crew would stop being a merchant ship inside a month. And everyone on this vessel had learned that lesson the hard way, a long time ago, from people who hadn't survived learning it. He'd won 3 culinary competitions under a different name before this assignment. Nobody on absolute authority would ever know that. It didn't matter to the mission. It mattered to him. Marchetti, working the counter beside him, cracked her knuckles and went back to the crate. 30 minutes, she said. I heard. You nervous? Herrera looked at the knife in his hand, at the thin curve worn into the blade from years of pulling it across the same kind of vegetable, in the same kind of galley, on the same kind of morning. No, he said, and it was true. And it was also the strangest thing about him, if you knew what he'd lost to get here. Up on the bridge, the displays in front of Vasquez were not the displays a customs inspector would have found if they'd ever bothered to look. Steady Commerce's registered systems showed cargo manifests, fuel reserves, standard merchant-grade sensors with a range of maybe 400 kilometers. The systems Vasquez was actually reading showed something else. 200 ships, scattered across 11 systems, indistinguishable from real merchant vessels, because in every measurable way, they were real merchant vessels, with real cargo, real crews, real decades of trade relationships that had never once been faked, because the decision back at the start had been that nothing fake could survive 31 years of scrutiny. Only the truth could last that long. So they had built the truth and armed it and waited. 30 minutes became 20. Vasquez set her coffee down without drinking from it. "Confirm boarding profile," she said. "Confirmed. They're going to board, same as the last 4 times they've hit a convoy this size. Send a team, secure the bridge, loot the cargo, disable the engines, tow what's worth towing." And they still think that works. They've never had a reason to think otherwise. Vasquez almost smiled. In another life, she had commanded a real merchant vessel through this same corridor before the raid started, before the Navy came to her with a proposal that sounded insane the first time she heard it and had sounded less insane every year since. 22 years of Navy service. 4 years wearing this particular face. She had stopped being able to say, some mornings, which version of herself was the real one, and had decided a long time ago that the question didn't matter. A merchant who was also prepared to fight wasn't a merchant pretending. Both things were true at once, all the way down. 10 minutes out, the Vorai wing dropped from stealth in standard raider formation, 5 raiders, and a command cruiser, weapons cold, boarding pods primed. Doxar's voice came through on an open frequency, the way it always did, because he had never once needed to hide his approach from a target that couldn't shoot back. "Merchant vessel steady commerce," he said. "Cut engines and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be treated as an act of war." Vasquez picked her coffee back up. On the display in front of her, a single line of text sat waiting, keyed to a channel none of Doxar's instruments could see. 8 ships, 8 captains, all of them people she'd trained herself, some of them people she'd buried friends beside. She opened the channel. "All 8, she said. "Prepare to receive." The Vorai boarding pods locked onto steady Commerce's hull with a sound like a held breath finally let go, a deep metallic clamp that Herrera felt through the soles of his boots before he heard it. He kept peeling. Beside him, Marchetti's hands didn't slow either, though her eyes flicked once toward the bay door. 6 armored shapes dropped through the breach 30 seconds later. Herrera looked up at them the way a man looks up at weather he has already checked the forecast for. He finished the vegetable in his hand, set the knife down. That was the wrong detail nobody, on absolute authority, would ever manage to explain afterward. Why the cook hadn't run. Then the lights went red, and 11 years of quiet stopped being quiet. Marchetti had the boarding team's commander face down before he finished drawing his sidearm. She told Herrera once, back when they were still learning to trust each other, that peeling vegetables and disarming a man twice, her mass used the same muscles, if you did them both often enough and never let either one make you soft. She had his wrist bent past, where wrists were meant to bend, and she was not gentle about it, and around the cargo bay the other 5 members of the boarding party found themselves on the deck in roughly the same amount of time it would have taken them to say the word resistance. 11 seconds. Doxar watched the feed from absolute authority, and the bioluminescent ridges along his jaw stopped pulsing entirely, which for a man who had raided 47 vessels was a thing that had simply never happened before. "Pull them back," he said. "Pull the team back now." He was already too late. Along the hulls of all 8 ships in the convoy, panels that had been logged as cargo bracing for 11 years came apart on hinges nobody in Vorai naval intelligence had ever catalogued. because nobody in Vorai naval intelligence had ever had a reason to look. Weapons batteries rose out of housings built to look, from any external scan, like grain silos. 44 seconds. That was how long it took 8 merchant freighters to become something that had never officially existed. And by the time the last battery locked onto target, 3 of Doxar's raiders were already turning to run. They didn't make it. 6 ships went from combat formation to debris field in under a minute and a half. No warning shots, no demand to stand down first. Vasquez had made that decision years ago in a briefing room that didn't exist anymore, and she had never once regretted it. A Q-ship that gave a raider time to call for reinforcements was a Q-ship that had failed its entire purpose. You didn't get to warn people who'd never warned you. On Absolute Authority's bridge, Doxar stood very still and watched 6 sets of transponder signals go dark on a display he had trusted absolutely 20 minutes ago to tell him the truth. Vasquez opened his command frequency on a channel encrypted well enough that he wouldn't be able to trace where the intrusion had come from, not that it would matter to him within the hour. "Fleet Commander," she said, "you have 30 seconds to cut your drives. After that, my ships stop being interested in your survival." Silence on the line. Not fear. Vasquez had heard fear on that kind of silence before, and this wasn't it. This was a man doing math he didn't have the numbers for. "Who are you?" Doxar said. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a man's entire understanding of the last 31 years coming apart in real time. 29 seconds. He cut his drives in 11. They brought a Terran intelligence officer up from Steady Commerce's lower deck to speak with him directly. A woman Vasquez had worked alongside for years, but whose face Doxar had never once seen, because that was also part of the design. Some faces were meant to stay unseen for exactly this moment. "You're going to want to know how long," she told him, standing in the wreckage-lit dark of his own captured bridge. "Everyone always wants to know how long." Doxar's scarred mandible tightened. "Tell me." 31 years, she said. "Since the first raid on an unarmed human conv that we couldn't get justice for through any channel your government recognized. We built a program instead. We called them Q-ships, after an old wartime idea from our own history, and then we did something your side never accounted for. We made every single one of them a real merchant vessel first. Real cargo. Real trade routes. Real relationships with real Vorai port authorities who like doing business with us." She let that sit. "We never stopped being merchants. We just also stopped being defenseless." "Impossible," Doxar said, and even he seemed to hear how thin the word sounded now. "1 ship, maybe 2, disguised, but a fleet, sustained for decades, and nothing ever surfaced." 200, she said. "Give or take, scattered across 11 of your systems right now this morning while you're standing here. Grain haulers, machine parts freighters, a geological survey ship that's been quietly seeding your shipping lanes with something you're about to discover the hard way. You've been trading with us for 31 years, Fleet Commander. You just never asked what else we might be doing while we traded." Vorai High Command received the engagement report 9 minutes later, and the officer who read it first had to read it twice before he believed the casualty numbers belonged to a single convoy raid. "Verify the target designation," Fleet Marshal Guthfer said, leaning over the display in his own command center 3 systems away. "Steady Commerce. 11-year registry. Confirm this is the same vessel." "Confirmed, sir. Same transponder history, same trade manifest, same captain of record for the last 4 years." "Then how?" Guthfer said, and stopped, because there wasn't a way to finish that sentence that didn't sound like an accusation aimed at every port inspector and customs officer who'd cleared that ship for over a decade. The problem, and it took Vorai High Command the better part of an hour to fully understand the problem, was not that one merchant convoy had turned out to be armed. The problem was that they had no way, none, not one reliable method left standing, of knowing which of the hundreds of other human trade vessels currently docked at Vorai ports, currently transiting Vorai space, currently doing business with Vorai citizens who liked them and trusted them, might also not be what their paperwork said they were. Every unarmed merchant ship was now, functionally, an armed one. Not because it necessarily was, because nobody could prove it wasn't. Guthver ordered a response fleet forward within the hour, into the Helonvo's corridor, to recover what remained of Doxar's command and reassert some version of the story that made sense of what had happened. It felt, to the officers assembling that fleet, like the only available answer. It did not occur to any of them that the corridor they were rushing into had been surveyed 14 separate times over the preceding 2 years by a slow, unremarkable geological research vessel flying a commercial license, and that the survey had not been about rock composition at all. Back on steady commerce, Herrera hadn't moved from the galley the whole time. He'd finished securing the last of the boarding team's weapons into a locker Marchetti had welded shut herself, and then he'd gone back to the counter, because the vegetables from before the breach were still sitting there half-peeled, and somebody was going to want dinner regardless of how many raider ships had stopped existing in the last 10 minutes. He picked the knife back up. His hands were steady. They had been steady the whole time, which was the thing about Herrera that even Vasquez, who had recruited him personally, still didn't fully have words for. Not calm because nothing touched him, but calm because everything already had, years ago, and there wasn't much left that could touch him the same way twice. Marchetti found him there and leaned against the counter, breathing hard from the boarding fight, blood on one knuckle that wasn't hers. "You good?" she asked. "I'm good." He didn't look up from the vegetable. "You?" "I'm always good." She glanced toward the bay doors, where the captured Vorai boarding team sat zip-tied in a row against the bulkhead, very much alive, very much watching the two of them with an expression that hadn't finished deciding whether it was fear yet. "They're going to send more." "I know." "You scared?" Herrera set down a finished vegetable and picked up the next one. "No," he said, the same way he'd said it 6 hours earlier, and this time Marchetti didn't ask him why, because some questions you only got to ask a person once before the answer stopped being about the question at all. Up on the bridge, Vasquez watched the tactical display update, with Guthver's response fleet spinning up 3 systems away, exactly where her people had told her it would, exactly on the timeline they'd projected 4 months ago in a planning session that had felt, at the time, almost theoretical. "They're moving faster than we estimated," her first officer said. "They're moving exactly as fast as a fleet moves when its commander needs to look like he's doing something." Vasquez picked her coffee back up, finally, and found it had gone cold. She drank it anyway. "Send the signal to the survey ship. Tell her the corridor's about to get busy." "And Doxar." Vasquez looked at the man on her secondary display, sitting in the wreck of his own bridge, boarding teams confirmed alive and captured, 6 ships gone. A war he'd started that morning already unrecognizable from the one he thought he was fighting. "Hold him," she said. "He's not the one I need to talk to yet." Somewhere behind her, on a frequency none of Guthver's incoming fleet had any reason to be monitoring, a signal went out from steady commerce toward a ship registered as a commercial geological surveyor, currently sitting in the exact stretch of the Helonvo's corridor that Guthver's response fleet was about to cross at speed. The survey ship didn't answer. It didn't need to. It had been waiting 14 passes for this exact message. The response fleet hit the minefield at full burn, and for 3 full seconds, nobody on Guthver's flagship understood what had happened to them. 14 passes. That was how many times the slow, unremarkable survey vessel Long Horizon had drifted through this stretch of the Helonvo's corridor over the last 2 years, logging rock density and radiation counts for a mining consortium that existed, paid taxes, and had never once been flagged by Vorai customs as anything but exactly what it claimed to be. Nobody had thought to ask why a geological survey needed that many passes through the same empty stretch of space. Nobody had thought to ask, because there had never been a reason to. There was a reason now. 3 warships lost containment in the first wave alone, and the rest of Guthver's fleet broke formation hard. scattering into evasive patterns that only opened them up to the second layer waiting beneath the first. "Report," Guthfer said, gripping the rail of his command chair. "Unknown ordnance. Density suggests it's been seeded across the entire corridor, not just this section." A pause, the kind that meant the officer speaking didn't want to say the next part. "Sir, our charts show this region surveyed, repeatedly, by a licensed civilian vessel." Guthfer said nothing for a long moment. Behind him, on a secondary display nobody had bothered to silence, a status feed from the captured Absolute Authority continued its slow scroll of dead transponders and confirmed losses. Doxar spoke for the first time since his surrender. He'd said nothing through the boarding, nothing through the intelligence officer's revelation, nothing while his hands were bound, and he was walked to a holding compartment aboard his own captured ship. He'd sat there in silence long enough that the guard posted outside had started to wonder if something in him had simply stopped working. "She hesitated," he said, when Vasquez came to see him. Vasquez stood in the doorway, arms crossed, still in the faded blue jacket. "Who?" "Not her, me." His mandible, scarred from some engagement decades old, tightened around the words. "Before we boarded, my second asked if we should detain the cook, and I almost said no. 47 times I would have said no." His bioluminescent ridges pulsed, dim and slow, something closer to exhaustion than anger. "I don't know why I didn't." "Maybe some part of you already knew," Vasquez said. "Don't," Doxar said, sharp enough that the guard outside shifted. "Don't give me a story where I was clever enough to sense it coming. I raided 47 vessels and never once wondered what I was actually looking at. That's not instinct. That's luck, and it ran out this morning." Vasquez studied him a moment. In another life, a version of this conversation might have ended differently. "You want to know something," she said. "The ones who figure it out fastest afterward are usually the ones who were closest to the truth and didn't let themselves see it. That's not comfort. It's just what I've noticed." She left him with that. Behind her, Doxar sat very still, and for the first time since the breach, he was no longer thinking about the 6 ships he'd lost. He was thinking about every port his fleet had ever docked at, every merchant crew that had ever waved to him from a passing freighter, and wondering how many of them had been watching him the whole time. 6 systems away, Fleet Admiral Chenlong's task force dropped out of stealth directly above the Vorai shipyards, and for the length of one breath, nobody on the ground looked up. 1,200 human warships. They had been running dark for the better part of a week, threading a route through Vorai's own patrol gaps with a precision that only came from knowing those gaps by heart, because human intelligence had been mapping Vorai patrol patterns for longer than most of the officers currently on duty had been alive. The task force didn't target the planet. It didn't need to. It went straight for the shipyards, the dry docks, the half-built hulls of the next generation of raider cruisers sitting exposed and unguarded in orbit. "This isn't a war fleet," Chenlong told the shipyard's frantic hailing frequency in a voice that carried none of the satisfaction the moment might have earned him. "We're not here to conquer anything. We're here because your government sent raiders after unarmed convoys for 31 years, and today that stopped being free." Nobody answered him. There wasn't much to say to a fleet that had already won before announcing itself. Back in the Helonvo's corridor, one Vorai cruiser had broken off from the retreating remnant of Guthfer's response force and made what Vasquez would later admit, without much bitterness, was a genuinely good tactical approach. Coming in low against steady Commerce's flank, weapons hot, exploiting a blind spot in the freighter's defensive arc that shouldn't have existed on a ship this well prepared. It got one solid hit in before the point defense batteries found it. Steady Commerce shuddered hard enough to knock a half-peeled vegetable off the galley counter. Herrera caught it before it hit the deck, an old reflex, and set it back down without really thinking about it. "Shields at 60%, the first officer reported. That last hit clipped the secondary data relay." Vasquez felt the deck tilt fractionally under her boots as the ship's stabilizers compensated. "Casualties." "None reported," But sir, the officer's voice tightened. If they get a clean second hit on that relay, we lose the primary data core, full operational records, every Q-ship identity, every route, everything. 200 ships worth of 31 years, sitting in a core that a lucky second shot could turn into scrap. Vasquez had known this risk existed since before the corridor was chosen. She had never let herself dwell on it, because dwelling on it changed nothing about the plan, and the plan had never depended on nothing going wrong. It had depended on knowing what to do when something did. Bring the point defense grid around to cover the relay, she said, and get Marchetti a headcount on that cruiser's remaining weapons. It was Herrera who found the flaw in the plan first, standing in the galley with a vegetable in one hand and the ship groaning around him, and the flaw wasn't in the defense grid. It was in the assumption that the data core would survive at all if the cruiser got lucky twice. He set the vegetable down. He wiped his hands on his apron, the same unhurried motion from 6 hours earlier, except this time there was somewhere he needed to be. He hadn't told anyone in 4 years aboard this ship exactly why he'd volunteered for the program the way he had, not through the standard officer track, but sideways, through a civilian recruitment channel that most of the crew assumed meant he'd simply needed a job. He let them assume it. It was easier than the truth, which was that a Vorai raider had hit a transport carrying his wife and daughter 9 years ago, and the ship had gone down with everyone aboard, and Herrera had spent the 2 years afterward learning that grief without a place to put it just sits in a person and rots. The Q-ship program had given him a place to put it. Not revenge, exactly. Vasquez had never sold it to him as revenge, and he'd never wanted it framed that way. Just a use. A purpose shaped exactly to the size of what he'd lost. He climbed toward the bridge 2 decks up, moving fast now, past crew securing loose equipment, past Marchetti barking coordinates into a headset. Herrera, she called after him. Galley's clear, you don't need to. I know, he said, and kept moving. The Vorai cruiser lined up its second approach with the same precision as the first, and on absolute authority's captured bridge, Doxar watched the tactical feed with his bound hands very still in his lap, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel today toward a Vorai crew he'd never met. A kind of grim, useless hope that they wouldn't get the shot. They almost did. Point defense caught the cruiser's opening salvo at the edge of its range, close enough that Steady Commerce's whole frame rang like a struck bell, far enough that the relay held. Barely. Shields at 40%, the first officer said. That's the last hit this ship takes before the data core is exposed. Vasquez looked at the tactical display, then at the small comm indicator that had just lit up beside it. Herrera, calling up from a station 2 decks below the bridge, a station he had no formal reason to be standing at. She opened the channel. Go ahead. I have an idea, Herrera said. It's not a military one. At the 70% mark of what would later be called, in briefings none of the people in that cargo bay would ever read, the single longest sustained deception operation in the history of human Vorai contact, the true shape of the danger finally came into focus for everyone watching from either side. It wasn't the cruiser. The cruiser was almost beaten already. It was the data core, 31 years of the deepest secret ever kept by a human fleet, sitting one lucky shot away from destruction. And the only tool left to save, it belonged to a man with no military rank at all, standing at a console built for logging cargo manifests, about to do something nobody in the entire chain of command above him had ever planned for. I'm listening, Vasquez said. Herrera's voice came through steady, the same steadiness he'd carried peeling vegetables through a boarding raid 6 hours ago. The data caused the target because it's centralized, so stop making it a target. There's a channel built into every merchant vessel's registry system, insurance grade, meant to protect owners from fraud claims if a ship goes dark. A Deadman package. It triggers automatically if a captain doesn't check in, and it dumps a full data mirror to whatever commercial broker holds the ship's policy. He paused. Nobody in military planning ever thought to strip it out of our systems, because on paper we're not military, we're merchants. It's still just sitting there, live. Vasquez understood in the space of a breath. You want to trigger it manually. I want to send everything to Ketavar before that cruiser gets a clean shot at us. Our broker there has held steady commerce's policy for 11 years. A small, humorless huff, almost a laugh. Turns out he's one of ours too. On the tactical display, the Vorai cruiser was already coming back around for its second real attempt, and Vasquez didn't have time left to weigh this the way she'd have liked to. She had exactly long enough to look at what she actually knew about the man on the other end of the channel. 4 years of watching him run a galley like it was the only job he'd ever wanted. 4 years of never once asking him why a man with that kind of stillness had walked away from whatever life he'd had before this one. She'd always assumed it was grief. She'd never asked what kind. "Do it," she said. Herrera's hands moved over the console the way they moved over a vegetable, economical, sure, no wasted motion. Civilian authority. That was the part nobody in either fleet had planned for, because military systems answered to military chains of command, and this wasn't a military system. It was a commercial insurance failsafe, and commercial failsafes answered to the person standing at the terminal wearing the ship's registered crew credentials, which Herrera had held, honestly, unremarkably, for 4 straight years. He keyed the transmission. 200 Q-ship identities. Every route, every cover, every name behind every merchant vessel that had ever quietly carried a second purpose through Vorai space. All of it left steady commerce in a single compressed burst, aimed at a small commercial exchange office in Ketavar that had, for 11 years, processed cargo insurance claims for a dozen legitimate shipping firms and one very patient human intelligence operation. The cruiser's second shot came in half a second after the transmission cleared. It hit the relay dead center. The data core went dark. It didn't matter anymore. The truth was already gone, already safe, already sitting on a server in Ketavar that no Vorai warrant would ever think to search, because why would anyone search an insurance broker's backup files for a war? Vasquez found Herrera afterward in the same place she always found him. The galley had taken some rattling in the fight, a few loose containers on the deck, a crack running through one storage panel, but the prep counter was exactly where it had always been, and Herrera was standing at it, wiping it down with a cloth, the same unhurried motion from the start of all this, except now his shoulders had dropped in a way she'd never quite seen on him before. "You saved the whole program," she said. "I know." He didn't look up from the counter. 9 years ago, a raider hit a transport in the Kessel approach. My wife was aboard, my daughter. He set the cloth down, finally, and met Vasquez's eyes. "I never told you because it didn't matter to the job. It still doesn't. I didn't do that back there for them." He picked the knife up off the counter where it had sat, untouched, through everything, the boarding, the fight, the cruiser's 2 shots. He didn't use it. He just held it a moment, the worn curve of the blade catching the light, and set it back down. "I did it because it was the right call, and I happened to be standing there." Vasquez didn't say anything to that. Some things didn't need a response. She just stood with him a moment in the quiet, 2 people who had both learned, in different ways and at different costs, that patience wasn't the absence of doing something. It was doing something and waiting 31 years for the moment it mattered. Fleet Marshal Guthfer's formal surrender came 4 hours later, transmitted from what remained of his response fleet to a human relay ship that had, until that morning, been registered as a passenger liner running the Ketavata Prime circuit. The terms were not what Vorai High Command had braced for. No territorial demands, no crushing reparations, no occupation force moving in behind Chenlong's task force to claim the shipyards it had gutted. Just a set of conditions that read, to the officers forced to review them, less like a victor's terms and more like an accountant closing out a very old, very patient account. "They're not asking for anything we'd expect a conqueror to ask for," Guthfer said, reading the terms a 3rd time in his own quarters, alone, his voice flat with something between relief and disbelief. He wasn't wrong to be confused. The terms hadn't been written by soldiers. The woman who met Vasquez aboard Steady Commerce 2 days later introduced herself only as Thesva, and she wore the plain civilian dress of a Vorite trade liaison, and she carried herself like someone who had been waiting a very long time to stop pretending to be smaller than she was. 22 years, Thesva said, once the pleasantries had been dispensed with. That's how long the Renewal faction has been positioning people inside Vorai High Command, waiting for exactly this. Not a war we could win. A war bad enough and clear enough in its cause that the Raider Doctrine finally became impossible to defend in front of our own people. She studied Vasquez with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite envy either. We needed the hegemony to lose. Cleanly. Publicly. In a way, nobody could spin into another round of the same policy. You used us, Vasquez said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just true. We used the fact that you'd already built something patient enough to be used. Thesvar allowed herself something close to a smile. 31 years on your side, 22 on ours. Neither of us knew about the other until this week. Funny, isn't it, how much two sides can have in common while trying to end the same thing from opposite directions? Guthva was removed from command within the month. High Command's Raider Doctrine, the policy that had authorized 47 merchant boardings a year and counting, was dismantled from the inside by officers who had been waiting decades for a defeat too obvious to argue with. The Q-ships stayed exactly where they were, 200 of them, scattered, quiet, indistinguishable, still trading, still real. Nobody on the Vorai side would ever again be able to say with confidence which merchant hull was only a merchant hull. Doxar was released 3 weeks later under terms neither side publicized. He didn't ask to see Vasquez again before he left, and she didn't offer. There wasn't anything left between them that needed saying out loud. He kept one thing from the engagement, though nobody had given him permission to keep it, and nobody ever asked him to give it back. A data slate with a recording of Steady Commerce's cargo bay, the moment the lights first turned red. He watched it sometimes, in the years afterward, whenever a new officer under his command started to talk too confidently about how well they understood what they were looking at. The Terran Council's official statement, released weeks later, ran 4 paragraphs and mentioned none of it, not Herrera, not the Deadman package, not a cook with 9-year-old grief who'd made a call no one in his chain of command had trained him to make. It spoke instead of a successful defensive engagement, an unspecified intelligence advantage, a diplomatic opening with reform elements inside Vorai leadership. Clean, bloodless on paper. Exactly the kind of statement that made a 31-year secret easy to keep for another 31, if it came to that. Vasquez read it once, standing on Steady Commerce's bridge, and set it aside without comment. That evening, the ship ran its galley the same as any other night in port. Real crew, real food. A trade contract due for renewal in the spring, same as it had been every spring for 11 years. Herrera finished wiping down the prep surface and set the cloth aside. The knife was still where he'd left it, the blade worn thin from years of honest work. He didn't pick it up again. Vasquez stood in the doorway a moment, coffee in her chipped mug, watching him close the galley down for the night. Then she turned and walked back toward the bridge, where 8 ships and 200 more like them sat waiting in the dark, patient as they had always been, for whatever came next. A merchant who is also prepared to fight is the most dangerous thing in any port. They had been warned. Every light in the cargo bay had gone red.